In the shadows of ancient Lydia, a king ruled who believed his power was absolute. His name was Candaules. He was wealthy, respected, and confident, yet fatally blinded by pride. According to the Greek historian Herodotus, Candaules became obsessed with one idea, proving that his queen was the most beautiful woman alive. Words were not enough. Praise was not enough. He wanted proof. And so he committed the mistake that would end his reign. Candaules forced his most trusted bodyguard, a man named Gyges, to secretly look upon the queen while she was undressing. Gyges resisted. He warned the king that such an act violated honor, loyalty, and divine law. But Candaules insisted. The king's command could not be refused. Gyges obeyed, believing no one would ever know. But the queen saw him. She understood immediately what had happened, and who was responsible. In silence, she planned her response. The next day, Gyges was summoned. The queen did not scream. She did not accuse. Instead, she offered him a choice that would decide the fate of Lydia itself. Either kill King Candaules and take the throne alongside her, or be executed for the dishonor forced upon her. There was no escape, no third option. Trapped between loyalty and death, Gyges chose survival. That night, inside the royal chamber, King Candaules was assassinated. By morning, the man who once served as a guard sat on the throne, ruling Lydia as king, with the queen beside him. Ancient oracles later approved Gyges' rule, but warned that vengeance would come to his bloodline generations later. This was not a king who sacrificed his queen to save an empire. This was a ruler destroyed by arrogance, a queen reclaiming control through power, and an empire transformed by betrayal. Yet over centuries, the story was twisted. What began as a lesson about pride and honor became a scandalous myth of a king who gave away his queen. History, once again, was reshaped by rumor rather than truth. Candaules' downfall began with a belief that nothing connected to him could be questioned, challenged, or hidden. As king of Lydia, one of the wealthiest kingdoms of the ancient world, he lived surrounded by gold, obedience, and constant affirmation. His authority was not limited to politics or war. He believed it extended into morality, privacy, and even the unspoken boundaries that separated a ruler from the gods. Over time, this unchecked power shaped his thinking. He no longer saw limits. What he desired, he assumed, was justified simply because he was king. This mindset slowly transformed admiration into obsession, particularly when it came to his wife. Candaules did not merely love his queen, he wanted the world to recognize her beauty as an extension of his own greatness. To him, her perfection was proof that he was favored above all other men. Words of praise were no longer enough. He grew frustrated that others could not truly understand what he possessed, and this frustration turned into a dangerous need for validation. In ancient societies, especially in Lydia and Greece, the privacy of a woman, particularly a queen, was sacred. To violate that boundary was not only socially disgraceful, but also a challenge to divine order. Yet Candaules dismissed these traditions. He convinced himself that his position placed him above custom and above shame. When he ordered Gyges to secretly view the queen, he believed he was demonstrating trust, not committing a crime. In his mind, a loyal servant would appreciate the honor of witnessing such beauty. What Candaules failed to understand was that loyalty has limits, and honor cannot survive humiliation. Gyges' refusal and discomfort should have served as a warning, but pride does not listen. The king interpreted resistance as ignorance, not wisdom. Candaules' obsession reveals a deeper psychological flaw, the need to possess not only power, but recognition. He did not simply want to rule Lydia, he wanted to be admired in ways that crossed into the personal and the forbidden. By exposing his queen, he reduced her from a partner to a symbol, an object meant to confirm his superiority. This act stripped her of agency and dignity, turning royal intimacy into spectacle. In doing so, Candaules unknowingly transferred power away from himself. A ruler who cannot respect boundaries cannot maintain authority. His inability to see his wife as an individual with honor and will set the stage for his destruction. The tragedy of Candaules lies in how small his mistake appeared to him. He did not order a massacre or lose a war. He committed what he believed was a harmless act driven by pride. Yet in ancient moral thinking, such arrogance invited punishment. Kings were expected to embody balance and restraint. By violating these expectations, Candaules placed himself outside the protection of tradition and fate. His obsession blinded him to the danger he created within his own household. The queen's silence was not submission, it was calculation. In believing himself untouchable, Candaules became vulnerable. His pride did not just offend honor, it dismantled the very foundation of his rule. Gyges is often remembered as the man who killed a king and seized a throne, but this version of the story hides the uncomfortable truth of his position. He was not a schemer waiting for power, nor a traitor driven by ambition. Gyges was a soldier bound by oath, honor, and fear, serving directly under the authority of King Candaules. In the ancient world, refusing a king was not a simple act of defiance. It was an invitation to death. When Candaules ordered Gyges to secretly observe the queen, Gyges immediately understood the gravity of what was being demanded. He protested, warning the king that such an act violated custom, morality, and the sacred boundaries of marriage. His resistance was sincere, rooted in the values expected of a loyal guard. Yet sincerity meant nothing against absolute power. Candaules insisted, dismissing Gyges' concerns as foolishness and misunderstanding. Placed in this impossible situation, Gyges faced a dilemma that had no honorable solution. Obeying the king meant committing an act of shame, risking the wrath of both the queen and the gods. Disobeying the king meant execution for insubordination. Ancient loyalty was not a contract. It was a chain. Gyges chose obedience not because he desired to look upon the queen, but because survival demanded submission. His compliance was reluctant, fearful, and deeply uncomfortable. Herodotus makes this clear by emphasizing Gyges' anxiety and his attempt to remain unseen. This was not the behavior of a conspirator, but of a man trying to escape disaster. The moment the queen noticed Gyges, his fate was sealed. From that instant, Gyges was no longer merely a witness to the king's arrogance. He became a participant in a crime he never wanted to commit. The queen's response transformed Gyges from a passive victim of royal command into a pawn trapped between two deadly powers. When she later summoned him and presented her ultimatum, Gyges again found himself without choice: execution for dishonor or assassination for survival. Both paths led through blood. Importantly, the queen did not offer him power as a reward, she offered him life. Kingship was a consequence, not a goal. Gyges' decision to kill Candaules was not driven by greed or rebellion, but by the brutal logic of ancient politics. Once the king violated sacred boundaries, loyalty lost its meaning. By forcing Gyges into dishonor, Candaules had already broken the bond between ruler and servant. In killing the king, Gyges was not overthrowing legitimate authority. He was responding to a ruler who had already undermined his own legitimacy. This distinction mattered deeply in ancient thought, which is why oracles later approved Gyges' reign, even while warning of future consequences. The tragedy of Gyges lies in how history simplifies him. He is labeled a usurper, yet his rise began with obedience, not ambition. His story reveals the dark reality of absolute monarchy, where loyalty could become a weapon turned against the loyal themselves. Gyges did not seek power, Power was forced upon him by a king who mistook authority for entitlement. The Queen of Lydia stands as the most powerful and least understood figure in this story, largely because history records her actions while leaving her name behind. In Herodotus' account, she is silent for much of the narrative, yet her silence is not weakness. It is awareness. From the moment she noticed Gyges watching her, she grasped the full meaning of the betrayal. She understood that this humiliation was not an accident, nor the act of a servant acting alone, but a deliberate violation orchestrated by her own husband. In ancient societies, a queen's honor was inseparable from the stability of the throne itself. By exposing her, Candaules did not merely insult her as a woman, he undermined her status as queen and protector of royal legitimacy. Rather than reacting with emotion, the queen chose control. She did not cry out, summon guards, or publicly shame the king. Such actions might have satisfied anger, but would have left her powerless within a system designed to favor the ruler. Instead, she waited. This delay was calculated. It allowed her to transform personal humiliation into political leverage. By summoning Gyges privately, she placed herself at the center of the unfolding power shift. In that moment, she reversed the roles forced upon her. The king had treated her as an object to be displayed. She now treated the men around her as pieces on a board. Her ultimatum was precise and merciless, not driven by cruelty, but by necessity. In a world where a woman's honor defined her survival, forgiveness would have been interpreted as weakness. Allowing Candaules to live would mean accepting continued humiliation and signaling that royal boundaries could be violated without consequence. By demanding the king's death, she restored moral order as it was understood in her time. Gyges' execution was the alternative, not as revenge, but as justice within the codes of the era. She did not offer Gyges' kingship as a prize. She forced him to choose between two fates already determined by the king's actions. What makes the queen's role extraordinary is her understanding of power. She recognized that legitimacy does not flow solely from bloodlines or crowns, but from honor and consent. Once Candaules shattered that foundation, his rule became hollow. By aligning herself with Gyges, she ensured continuity of the state while removing the source of disorder. This was not a personal coup, but a strategic correction. Ancient listeners of Herodotus would have recognized this logic, even if modern audiences struggle with it. The queen's decision to marry Gyges was not submission, but consolidation. Marriage in ancient monarchies was a political instrument, a means of transferring authority smoothly and preventing civil conflict. Through this act, she became the bridge between the old regime and the new. Her power did not come from the sword that killed Candaules, but from her ability to define what rule was acceptable. History often reduces her to a scandalous figure, yet she was the architect of stability in the aftermath of chaos. In reclaiming control, she reshaped the fate of Lydia, proving that silence, when guided by intelligence, can be more powerful than force. The assassination of King Candaules is often misunderstood as a calculated political coup designed to preserve the stability of Lydia. But such an interpretation imposes modern logic onto an ancient moral framework. In reality, the killing of the king had nothing to do with saving the empire from collapse or external threat. Lydia was not facing invasion, rebellion, or economic crisis at the time. The kingdom was wealthy, secure, and firmly under royal control. The event that ended Candaules' reign was deeply personal, rooted in violations of honor and survival rather than strategy or statecraft. To the ancient mind, this distinction was crucial. Power was legitimate only when it respected sacred boundaries. Once those boundaries were broken, the ruler himself became the danger. Candaules' act was not merely a private sin, but a public rupture of moral order. By forcing Gyges to observe the queen, he shattered the trust that bound king, household, and gods together. In ancient cultures, especially those influenced by Greek moral philosophy, the ruler was expected to embody restraint. His personal behavior reflected the health of the state. When Candaules ignored custom and shame, he symbolically weakened his right to rule. This loss of legitimacy mattered more than armies or wealth. A king who could not govern himself could not govern others. For Gyges and the queen, the choice was not between loyalty and rebellion, but between death and survival. Gyges' execution would have erased the immediate scandal, but it would have left the core injustice untouched. The queen's dishonor would remain unaddressed, and the king's behavior would go unpunished. Such an outcome would signal that royal power was absolute, free from consequence. In ancient thought, this imbalance invited chaos. The assassination was therefore an act of moral correction, not political preservation. It restored the violated order by removing the source of transgression. Calling this event an attempt to save the empire misunderstands how ancient societies understood stability. Empires were not saved through sacrifice of individuals, especially queens, but through adherence to cosmic and social law. The queen was not offered as a bargaining tool, nor was the throne traded to prevent disaster. Instead, the act reflected a belief that justice, even when violent, prevented future disorder. Herodotus reinforces this idea by noting that the Delphic oracle later recognized Gyges as king, while still warning that his descendants would eventually pay for the bloodshed. This dual judgment highlights the ancient belief that actions could be necessary yet still carry long-term consequences. The later distortion of this story reveals more about human fascination with scandal than about history itself. Over time, the narrative was reshaped into a tale of political sacrifice, suggesting that Candaules deliberately offered his queen to maintain power. This version transforms arrogance into strategy and humiliation into negotiation. Such simplification strips the story of its moral complexity. Candaules did not act to protect Lydia. He acted to satisfy his pride. His death was not a calculated exchange, but the inevitable result of unchecked authority colliding with ancient codes of honor. Understanding this distinction restores the story's true meaning. It is not a lesson about ruthless politics, but about the fragile nature of power when separated from restraint. The empire did not need saving. The king did, and he failed to save himself. The transformation of Candaules' story over time demonstrates how easily history becomes reshaped by rumor, repetition, and the human appetite for scandal. Herodotus' original account was not written as sensational gossip, but as a moral narrative intended to explore themes of hubris, honor, and the consequences of violating social boundaries. Yet as the story traveled across centuries, cultures, and languages, its meaning shifted. What was once a cautionary tale about arrogance gradually evolved into a lurid myth of sexual sacrifice and political bargaining. This distortion did not happen suddenly. It emerged through retelling, simplification, and the tendency to favor shocking interpretations over uncomfortable truths. In its earliest form, the story centers on responsibility. Candaules is punished not because he was weak, but because he misused power. The queen is not a victim traded away, but a figure who reasserts agency in a system designed to deny it. Gyges is not a scheming usurper, but a man trapped by authority and forced to choose between dishonor and death. These nuances, however, are fragile. As audiences grew further removed from the cultural values of the ancient world, they began interpreting the events through modern assumptions. The complexity of honor-based societies was flattened into familiar tropes of betrayal, lust, and ambition. Political propaganda also played a role in reshaping the narrative. Later rulers and storytellers found the tale useful as a warning against tyranny or, conversely, as justification for rebellion. By portraying Candaules as a king who gave away his queen, the story could be used to emphasize moral decay at the top of society. This version was more memorable and easier to spread. It turned a subtle moral failure into a shocking image, ensuring the story's survival while sacrificing its accuracy. In doing so, it replaced ethical inquiry with spectacle. The persistence of this distorted version reveals an important truth about historical memory. People remember what unsettles them more than what instructs them. A king destroyed by pride is common. A king who supposedly trades his queen for power is unforgettable. Over time, repetition gave this false framing an illusion of truth. Each retelling stripped away context until only the most scandalous interpretation remained. This is how myths are born, not from lies alone, but from selective emphasis and forgotten details. Modern audiences, especially in the age of viral content, are particularly vulnerable to such distortions. Headlines favor shock over substance, and complexity is often sacrificed for speed and impact. As a result, Candaules' story is frequently cited as proof of moral corruption in ancient courts, rather than as a meditation on the limits of power. The lesson shifts from self-restraint to sensational betrayal, altering the purpose of the narrative entirely. Restoring the original meaning does more than correct a historical error. It reminds us that history is not merely a collection of dramatic events, but a record of how societies understood justice, authority, and consequence. The story of Candaules was never meant to glorify scandal. It was meant to warn that power without humility destroys itself. The fact that this message was overshadowed by myth is itself part of the lesson, one that reveals as much about later generations as it does about the ancient past. In the end, the story of King Candaules is not a tale of a ruler saving his empire through sacrifice, but a warning about what happens when power loses restraint. A king who believed himself above custom shattered the very foundation of his authority. A loyal god was pushed into an impossible choice where obedience became a curse. A queen, stripped of dignity, reclaimed control not through emotion, but through calculated justice. Lydia did not change hands because of war or conquest, but because arrogance invited consequence. This story survives not because of scandal, but because it exposes a timeless truth. When leaders confuse entitlement with authority, they create the conditions for their own downfall. History remembers crowns and assassinations, but beneath them lies a deeper lesson. Power that ignores honor cannot endure. Thank you for watching Unsolved History. If you enjoyed this deep dive into one of history's most misunderstood stories, don't forget to like the video, share it with fellow history lovers, and subscribe for more hidden truths, lost narratives, and untold power struggles from the ancient world. Until next time, remember, history is not just about what happened, but why it mattered.